Alright, we are continuing talking about types of capillaries, and then we'll get into the veins and stuff. So there are 3 types of capillaries in our body, and a capillary is a microscopic blood vessel that is going to actually be the type of vessel supplying blood directly to the tissues through a process called perfusion. And so all gas exchange and other substances like nutrients and waste get exchanged through the capillaries between that blood and their surrounding cells and tissue fluid, so the interstitial fluid. So the lumen of the capillaries can range from about 5 to 10 micrometers or micrometers. These are just barely wide enough for a red blood cell to squeeze through. So red blood cells will travel through capillaries basically single file because there's not enough space for them to flow through next to each other. They have to go through one at a time. And so the wall of capillaries are basically just an endothelial layer of surrounded by that basement membrane. Sometimes there can be some muscle fibers in here. Not a lot. It would just be very, very few muscle fibers in there. And so they are going to then have that layer of cells, single layer of cells, and then we've got that basement membrane out here. There are some different appearances, as you can see, of capillaries. We have 3 different types of capillaries in the body. We'll get into those in just a second. In larger capillaries, there can be a lot more endothelial cells, kind of bordering each other. In small capillaries, there might actually only be like a single cell that forms the entire vessel. All right, so these capillaries can get very, 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 very small. For capillaries to function properly, the walls actually must be able to leak, so they must be permeable and allow some substances to pass through. And so that's why we have these 3 different types of capillaries that are all going to vary in how much permeability they have. So our first type over here, the continuous capillaries. This is the most common type of capillary in the body. It's found in almost all vascularized tissues, so all tissues that have blood flow to them. So they have this complete endothelial lining with tight junctions between these endothelial cells. Usually tight junctions are impermeable. They're often incomplete junctions in capillaries, so that we do still have some permeability in these for exchanging water and other small molecules. So this would be things like glucose, certain gases like carbon dioxide and oxygen, and hormones, and leukocytes are white blood cells. So continuous capillaries are actually not found in the brain. They are going to have different types of movement up there. They can be part of the blood-brain barrier, which is a different structure. We'll talk more about that when we do the nervous system later in the semester, though. Our next type is fenestrated capillaries, and so these little openings are fenestrations. These are pores, so little openings in the cells. In addition to the tight junctions in the lining, these are going to make the capillaries a lot more permeable to larger molecules. So the number of fenestrations and how permeable they are and how large they are is going to vary according to where they're found in the body. They're found very commonly in the small intestines, which is where we're absorbing most of our nutrients, so it would make sense that we want slightly larger molecules to be able to pass through these capillaries. Kidneys are also going to have fenestrated capillaries. Their job is to filter the blood. And they're also found in something called the choroid plexus of the brain, which is producing cerebrospinal fluid. And they're also found in a lot of endocrine structures like the hypothalamus, pituitary gland, pineal gland, and thyroid glands. And then our third type, the sinusoid capillaries over here. As you can see, they have big gaps in between the cells, and the basement membrane isn't even complete in these. These are the least common type of capillary, but they are the most permeable. These are going to be kind of flattened capillaries. We've got lots and lots of gaps, so very, very permeable here. This makes them kind of look like Swiss cheese a little bit. And so these openings are going to allow for movement of very, very large molecules like plasma proteins and even larger cell types. So blood flow through these sinusoid capillaries is very, very, very slow, so that there is more time for the gases and nutrients and waste products and stuff to exchange. So we find these commonly in the liver and spleen, as well as the bone marrow and lymph nodes, and some endocrine glands. So the pituitary gland will have both fenestrated and sinusoid capillaries, and then the adrenal glands are also going to have sinusoid capillaries. Without these specialized capillaries, there's a lot of organs that are not going to be able to function. So like when the bone marrow makes new blood cells, the cells need to be able to get out of the bone marrow and into circulation somehow, and they're not going to be able to do that through continuous or fenestrated capillaries. They have to be able to get in through these sinusoid capillaries. The liver, as another example, we really, really need to be able to process all of the materials brought into the liver from the digestive tract and the spleen, as well as to get plasma proteins out into circulation. So this is what a capillary bed looks like, at least graphically represented. Obviously, it's going to look quite a bit different in an actual body. And so we are going to have these arterioles on one side of the capillary bed. On the other side is going to be a venule. It's the vein equivalent of an arteriole. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. And then we are going to have these vessels coming from the artery side. We have a metarteriole. This is a type of vessel that has structural characteristics of both the arteriole and a capillary. So this is kind of a transitional vessel between that arteriole and the capillary itself. And so they're going to have slightly different internal structures. Smooth muscle is not going to be continuous, but there can be rings to form sphincters, which can kind of help control blood flow into the capillaries, which is really, really important. We don't want too much pressure going into the capillary beds. We've got these precapillary sphincters, again, blocking off that blood flow. So blood is going to flow through this arteriole, and then it's going to come through this metarteriole, and then the sphincters will slowly release blood from that metarteriole out into the actual capillaries themselves, and that's where they're going to be doing all of that gas and nutrient and waste exchange. And so these precapillary sphincters work by sensing when the surrounding tissues need oxygen or have too many waste products and stuff like that. So they're getting those signals from the surrounding tissues to open or close. If they're closed, then blood's just going to flow straight through this channel right here, called a thoroughfare channel, and over to the venule side of this particular capillary bed. And we're just going to kind of bypass it completely, and that is going to basically keep the cells from getting like overloaded with oxygen or too much carbon dioxide gets picked up too early. Same idea with nutrients and waste products. We just don't always need to be doing that all the time, and so we need this method to bypass the capillary bed. So this kind of capillary bed, these are not always going to be flat. They're usually going to be 3D shaped, depending on where you're looking in the body, obviously. So we won't get into that particular structure too much. So like capillary beds and skeletal muscles are going to be kind of all around in between all of those muscle fibers and everything. During sleep or just general rest periods, there tends to be vessels in both areas that are usually going to be closed, and open up only occasionally to do some of that exchange to maintain basic life processes, and then they're going to be open more often when you're actually active. All right, let's get into veins. So we saw with arteries that tunica media, that muscular wall, is really, really, really thick. Lots of elastic fibers there, and veins are not going to have that same type of structure. So for large veins, that tunica externa, all of that connective tissue, is going to make up most of the vessel. We have a very thin muscular layer with only a few elastic fibers spread throughout the entire wall. In there, we do still have the vasorum and nervi vasorum, so nerves and blood vessels going to the blood vessel. We do still need to be able to feed these cells and everything, so we're still going to have those vessels in there. Medium-sized veins are going to have a slightly thicker muscular wall, slightly thinner tunica externa, still about the same number of elastic fibers in there, stuff like that. So again, veins are always going to carry blood back to the heart. It does not matter if it's oxygenated or deoxygenated, it's just carrying blood back to the heart. So veins tend to be very thin walls. They're going to have very large and irregularly shaped lumens because these are very low pressure vessels compared to arteries. The larger veins are also going to have valves in them. We can see that right here. And the valves in these vessels are going to function similarly to the way valves in our heart function, where they are going to open in one direction and let blood flow in that direction, and then close back up to prevent blood from flowing backwards. So we don't want that backflow into the capillaries or smaller vessels and stuff, because otherwise, without these valves, then because the pressure in veins is so low, then it's just going to kind of suck that blood backwards, along with the pull of gravity for most of our body. All right, venules, single layer of that tunica intima, and very, very, very thin layers of the other regions as well. All right. So the venous blood flow has to be moved differently than with arteries. So arteries are going to have blood flow moving based on the force of the heart pumping. But by the time we get through the capillary beds and everything, we lose all of that pressure from the heart beating. And so we need different mechanisms to move blood back to the heart through the veins. All right, and so there are different ways that this happens. Gravity, a little bit of residual blood pressure from those arteries, but only a little bit. We've got those one-way valves again, and then we have a couple pumps. So we have a skeletal muscle pump and a respiratory pump. So the way the skeletal muscle pump works is that all of these decent-sized veins in your body, especially in your arms and legs and stuff, they're usually going to be located in between different muscles of your body, and when those muscles are relaxed, the valves are going to be closed, and then when the muscles contract, they're putting pressure on the walls of the vein, so we're increasing pressure in the vein, and that's going to force a valve to open and blood to continue flowing back towards the heart. And so this is why sometimes it can get really uncomfortable to sit still for too long because you're not moving that blood flow. This is why people get up and walk on really, really long flights, and why it's a good idea to stop periodically on long drives and stuff like that to walk around a little bit and really help keep the blood from pooling in your veins too much. And the skeletal muscle pump is really helping to counteract that low pressure in the veins, as well as working against gravity, because if you think about it, our heart is pretty high up in our body, so most of our body has to work against gravity to push that blood back up to the heart. It's only a very, very small part of our body that is not working against gravity. So leg muscles, especially important for this, even arm muscles, are going to do this. And so there are some conditions like deep vein thrombosis, so blood clots in the veins, that can occur. Some people are really, really susceptible to them, but it's really important to keep that blood flow moving if you are super susceptible to that. Varicose veins can be another problem. We're actually going to come back to that in a second. I'm going to stick on this slide for a little bit because I don't have a picture for the respiratory pump. But the respiratory pump is going to work pretty similarly to the skeletal muscle pump, except instead of the vessels being squeezed in between a couple different muscles in the arms or legs, the act of breathing, so inhaling and exhaling, that's changing how much pressure is in that thoracic area. And so when you inhale, there's going to be an increased pressure that is going to kind of get exerted in the lungs and stuff like that as they refill with air. But that diaphragm is going to kind of move out of the way as it flattens downward, as well as helping to compress the abdominal cavity. And so basically this is going to kind of function again the same way and put pressure on these vessels to force those one-way valves open and get blood flowing back up towards the heart. Air pressure will change a little bit and kind of have an effect on this, but not as much as just the sheer pressure of breathing and changing positions of all of the different muscles in the thorax. All right, so varicose veins. So even though we've got valves and all of these other mechanisms of getting blood flowing through veins, there are still going to be some issues sometimes with getting that blood flow. There is going to always be times where that blood is going to pool, especially in the lower limbs because of gravity and stuff like that. And as blood pools in a vein, it's going to put more and more pressure on the walls of it. And obviously they are not as elastic as arteries are. And so this can cause some problems. It can put a lot of pressure on that particular area of the vein, as well as pressure in the smaller veins and venules, and even the capillaries if we're not moving blood back towards the heart at a good rate. And so increased pressure in these other vessels is going to cause some of the fluid to flow out of the capillaries into the interstitial fluid. And so that presence of extra fluid is going to lead to a condition called edema, that is swelling. All right, so all of that excess fluid is swelling and edema. This is happening to all of us at any given point in time, especially if you spend a lot of time on your feet. But there are certain types of edema that are beyond normal levels of swelling and do require medical treatment because that can put a lot of pressure on all of the tissues and everything. Varicose veins can be usually seen in more of the superficial veins of the legs. This happens when valves get to be defective and end up allowing blood to accumulate in the veins, so the valves are not preventing that backflow of blood. And this can cause the veins to kind of distend, so they get too large and their shape starts to change. They can twist on themselves, and that's how they can ultimately become visible as kind of bumps and stuff like that. They are more common in people who are going to produce a lot of estrogen and progesterone. They're frequently related to pregnancy. Nobody's really sure exactly why that makes them more susceptible, other than just there's a lot more work that the heart has to do to pump blood through the body and to the growing fetus, and they're going to be a lot more tired, so they might not be moving quite as much as they did before pregnancy. These can be just kind of a cosmetic nuisance, and they can be treated, but they can also get really itchy or painful sometimes, but there are some treatments. Compression socks and stuff like that can be really helpful, as well as elevating the feet and legs, but laser surgery and other procedures can help reduce their severity. So most of the blood in our body is going to be in our veins at any given time. So this is arteries, where our blood is within the arteries. Everything in blue, though, is veins. So they are considered to be blood reservoirs, and this is going to basically keep our blood stored somewhere because we can only have so much flowing through the heart and arteries at any given time. And that's just a table kind of showing the percentages and stuff, but we will pick up with circulatory pathways in the next video.